Hello, devotees of the Big Book Project. I'm so happy today to have with us for a return appearance Tom Flynn. Tom, you might remember, was with us for an episode where we talked about Roberto Bolaño's 2666. And today he's bravely coming forward to talk to me about The Kindly Ones by Jonathan Littell, which is the book that we're currently reading together for the Big Book Project. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks for having me back, Lori. And you really do know how to pick them, huh? This is, or maybe I volunteer for the ones that are are of a piece. But yeah, wow.
Yeah, I guess this is our third collective read for the Big Book Project, and I think they've all been pretty traumatic. Um, Maybe we'll step back a little bit before we get started with this week's reading portion, which was pages 333 to 427. And might I just ask, Tom, like whether you knew of this book previously and what you knew of it, and what are some of your impressions as I think you're reading it for the first time, correct?
Yes, I am reading it for the first time. Remind me what year the hardcover came out. Was it 2010 or just before then? I can't
I think
remember
it's
precisely.
2009.
Right, right. So I was still at 57th Street Books at that point. And Yeah, I mean, so I had a lot of awareness of it. It was on our front table. It sold fairly well for us. It was not my kind of novel. And also, I mean, there was a fair bit of pushback in the American like reviewing circles to it, and a lot of that did make it come across as a little bit more. I don't know what even the right terminology for it would be, like trauma porny almost in a way. That having read it now, or as far as in as I've gotten, I don't think is entirely accurate. Though I do think there might be some things that they were getting at that apply. So anyway, it was just not. It was just not. Despite the fact that it was a translation, all those things, it just wasn't my kind of thing. So I never picked it up. But it did sell for us. It sold. My memory is it sold reasonably well. Didn't do great in paperback, but did really just fine in hardcover. But yeah, it also was certainly the kind of book that once I took over the buying, I didn't need to keep in stock very regularly. Like it would be in stock, it would sell, and then I might wait a couple months before I brought it back in. That was its cycle. So it's not the kind of thing that, at least at that store, really maintained a level of prominence despite all the discourse that surrounded it, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, the book came out and I read it soon after it came out, and this was well before I got into book selling. So I guess I was aware to some extent, but probably not as much as I would have been aware regarding a new book today. It was controversial, and the reviews were very, very mixed,
Yeah.
and kind of all over the place. So, are there things that is the book pretty much what you expected it to be? Are there things that are surprising you a bit?
Um, And so in high school, I did Latin and ancient Greek, and so we spent a lot of time, especially in the Greek portion, translating and a lot. And also, that was just that kind of kid. I read all of the tragedies, in grammar school. So the name the kindly ones, tipped me to some of what was probably going to be, or some of the structure of it. Um, that never really came across in the reviews. I don't. My memory is the reviews themselves, and maybe I'm just misremembering. It was long enough ago, and again, this wasn't a book that I paid especially close attention to. That they didn't really grapple with some of the structural things he's doing, and I think that's kind of interesting. How it's a really weird novel. It's much weirder than I expected it to be. I expected it to be a little bit more straightforward than it is. And it's definitely playing with form and notions of memory, and just history, and I think really, and in a simultaneously engaging and repulsive manner. Like there's something, this character is on his own fairly repulsive, and the history he is recounting is horrifying, of course. But there is something propulsive about it. There's a line on the back of my the closing bit of copy on the back of my paperback says, it holds a mirror up to humanity and the reader cannot look away. I would dispute that claim, but I do get what they're what they're trying to get across there, that there is something about how he's writing it, how he's presenting it, that that it is really engaging in an interesting manner.
Yeah, I guess for me, the real kind of uh, gripping factor of this book is that we get a real excavation of Max as a person. And
Mhm.
I feel like the further you get into the book, the more we are becoming aware of some of his really weird and horrifying personal history, um, and some of his perversity and man, I don't even know all of the things we might call it. And sometimes I'm questioning while I'm reading it whether Jonathan Littell wants us to feel some kind of empathy for Max, or whether or not I don't feel like it's as simple as saying that Littell is trying to justify Max
Right.
by opening up this past. I don't know. What do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't. I go back and forth, as you know, a lot as to how much I care about authorial intent when they write things. I think this is an exception, though, because of the subject matter, the history, and also just the idea of um, this American writing in French about a Nazi officer and going into deep detail of the atrocities committed by the SS on the Eastern Front, like just throughout, right? And creating this character who is, I'm going to try not to use the word repulsive quite as often, but yeah, like that has a lot of, as we learn more and more about him, is deeply disturbing and disturbed in his own ways. So I do think we need to grapple that a little bit more than I would, normally say we do. I don't think he wants us to have empathy for him. I think if there is a larger project going on, it is that he's trying. Maybe it's that he's just trying to lay out the structure of what war, what ideology, what that kind of ideology can do to anyone, and that in some respects, despite how gross Max is in his personal dealings with other people or people that he, I mean, I don't know. Is he sociopathic? Is he psychopathic? I can't tell. But or is it something else? That's not something, but is a fictional character, so I'm not too worried about applying such labels. Um, but the machinery that he is a part of is in its own way so much more horrific than this disturbed, um, disgusting, frankly, quite scary human being. So perhaps that's an element of it. The one thing I did want to pick up on, though, that you mentioned was getting more information about Max and his personal history. And I would question how reliable Max is in all of this, for a host of reasons, one of which we kind of start to get at the end of this section that we read today. But structurally, this is him recounting his time in the German army as part of the SS. Years after the fact. So we're already, and he's claiming to be laying this all out for fact, but that means we have to trust that he's telling the truth about that. And as we get more personal detail about him, you know, perhaps the best way to cover up lies is to say things that no one would possibly expect you to admit to in the first place, right? I don't know,
Yeah.
but I don't find Max at times to be especially persuasive in his honesty, perhaps in this situation.
Yeah. I guess I'm not sure that I I feel empathy for Max, but that opening section of the book really does, for me anyway, kind of like lock in and make me really interested and curious about how his mind works.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think without that opening section, the book would be um, less effective, at least from my perspective. But just, some of the things that he says and trying to equivocate, kind of all humans have evil in them and you're no different than me. And, you know, those kind of things, it I think it really makes you interested in seeing this through for 900 pages to see kind of like how did this guy process what has happened not only during the war but his past as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that. I think that if there isn't something engaging about him, then you would just put it down, right? I mean, there's enough atrocity in here for a lifetime's worth of reading. Um, and I think, in terms of the structure, putting it out that way, making it so focused on his voice and where he is at this point in time, and that, yeah, there is going to be this deep reveal. If it even moderately hooks you, it's going to pull you along. And I'll say this: the book moves. Like, the prose keeps things moving at a good clip, which is pretty essential when the book is this big, but B, the things that you're going to read about are, you know, they're horrible, but in some ways they're disposed of just as quickly, right? Like, it
Yeah.
happens, but then you move on to the next thing. And so it's not, it doesn't quite have it doesn't have the same effect as 2666 with the part about the murders, where you bog down as it continues. And I think part of that is because it's Max's history. So you have a specific character but it's through his eyes and his experiences. It's not this larger, you know, bird's eye view of horror. Um, but also just in terms of like how it's written, I think Bolaño wanted to force you to stay in Santa Teresa, whereas Littell is doing something a bit different in terms of what he's using Max for in this exploration.
Yeah, I think it's very well written.
Mm-hmm.
um I mean,
Absolutely.
it's not, a lot of what is written is not easy to read just because it's so horrific, but the writing is good, and um I think that he does a really good job of some of the really, at least before we get to Stalingrad and the dead of winter, some of the really beautiful bucolic kind of descriptions
Mm-hmm.
of nature that are juxtaposed with these just scenes of mass murder and unspeakable human cruelty. I'm not sure that fictionally, I don't know of a book that's this graphic in getting into these murders like this. Do you?
Um, Nothing immediately comes to mind that is, I mean, also that would even fit into the same genre, Like, obviously there's like splatter horror that can get pretty terrible, but that's not even remotely doing the same thing or occupying the same space. And on the point of his style, you know, there is a very pared down, simple version of this that doesn't engage you as a reader, that makes it easy to discount, and then there's an overly worked version that makes it hard, like slows you down and makes you, so he's walking such a fine line just in terms of the pacing. But as you said, when he wants to turn it on, he can create these lush landscapes. Even as he's approaching Stalingrad from the air, I made note of, like, when they break through the clouds and he's able to see the frozen land beneath him. It's gorgeous. And then the next time they break the clouds, it's hell. And
Yeah.
it's a very effective. And I mean, there are a lot of writers today, like there are a lot of writers that would kill to be able to create a landscape like that under in any type of novel, under any circumstance.
And I I think you have to admire too the amount of research that must have gone in
Oh,
to
it's
this novel.
well,
Um,
it's one of those things where you wonder the motivation to do that kind and that amount of research in that area. I mean, that in itself is a marathon, right? That in itself is a feat of some kind, because I, it I've read other novels of the Holocaust or novels taking place in World War II. Volman's Europe Central comes to mind as probably the closest to what this one's doing in some respects, but very different at the same time. Um, and also just I took a peek at some of the criticism in France, and from the historical perspective, every historian is like, this is legitimate. I mean, this is there's he didn't, obviously he's creating fictional characters, but in terms of the facts on the ground, this is, yeah, he's nailed all of it, which also means he nailed a lot of really truly terrible things that he had to ingest in order to then create this novel. And I wonder that particular motivation, or what gets you to that point, because I don't know that I, even if motivated that way, I don't know that I could have seen it through.
yeah.
Like it's the kind of thing that staring that hard at that kind of that type of an abyss is, yeah, is worrisome.
Yeah, and the different theaters of this war too. I mean, we're in
Hmm.
Galicia, Ukraine, the Caucasus, now Stalingrad. Um, each one of those would have taken quite a bit of research. I mean, I've talked about it in the Substack posts. The Caucasus section just like astounds me with like the knowledge of the different ethnicities and um, yeah, I think it's tremendous. I've read some books about the Battle of Stalingrad before. I guess most significantly, Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate, and there's a huge Stalingrad section in that. It's a very different narrative though than this, but um, yeah, it's a remarkable. This is a remarkable novel. If you're just looking at the research, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the achievements of it is that for a lot of folks, I think we both know people who have an interest in World War II, or are World War II nuts, as they put it, and they will have a deep understanding of the Pacific theater, or they'll have a real understanding of, like, the the war in Africa. Like he is showing how complicated and how what a span the war in Europe had. The Eastern Front was, um, in a way that I haven't really encountered before. I certainly not in a novel like this, but even in histories of it, this is. I mean, it's a tour de force in that regard, right? Not just the quality of it, but also how he's in many ways demonstrating the machinery of the state, of what this state turned in, like, deliberately became, but then the war that it inflicted, and how, when you call it a world war, if you left out the Pacific and the rest of it, I don't think just the war in Europe by itself isn't is an all encompassing war, and he really does get that component across, and in a very impressive, and again, just back to style and prose, like it's a feat, like it's something that he pulled off really really well. um yeah, I am quite impressed by that. If I worry about what this does to a person to write, but
Um, okay, maybe we dig in a little bit to this week's reading, um, and I guess this week's reading starts off with Max's fears becoming true that there was going to be revenge uh, from those officers that didn't like him and weren't pleased with the report that he presented um, to the SS and to the army about the mountain Jews, because it just wasn't really the position of the SS. And so they decide they're going to ship him out and, and send him to Stalingrad, which the rumor has it, even before Max is sent there, that it's becoming just a horrible mistake on the part of the Nazis, and they're kind of in a position that it seems that they can't win. They don't have enough provisions, they don't have the right clothing, and they're just uh, kind of sunk in there up against the river, and there's not really going to be an easy way out. I guess. Did you have any kind of feeling for uh, kind of what Max anticipated he was going to face in Stalingrad versus what he actually did? I think he knew it was going to be bad, but I'm not quite sure that he realized it was going to be quite what he encountered.
yeah, I don't think he thought it was going to be quite what he encountered, but I also felt like he walked into it a little bit more blank slate-ish. Like there, I mean, I think what very early he after he lands, he realizes that he hasn't had anything to eat, and it kind of becomes and eating and what's available becomes more than a bit of a recurring theme for when living under a siege, which is a weird thing to be as an invading army, is to be under siege, but that's exactly what they were. Um, so but the way that he kind of trips into that realization, I think that yeah, he expected it to be nowhere near as dire as it was, that he wasn't being sent to a death trap, but he also kind of approached it, in some ways it felt to me a little bit like, okay, well, we'll see what comes next, sort of thing. So yeah, but by no means do I think he had a strong sense of it. But I don't think he went into it eyes wide open. I also don't think he went into it. Yeah, I'm trying to like figure out exactly what I mean by this. There's a way in which Max presents his movement and being in the world, where in some respects it's just sort of the world as it occurs to him, as he takes it as it comes. But there are other ways in which um, he is expressing more agency. And for whatever reason, I feel like this one, the way it was presented, and because he had no choice in the matter, it was much more of a, all right, we'll see what comes out of this. And yeah, so
I think one of the things that maybe is, I don't want to say a failure, but Thomas ends up being here. His friend Thomas seems
well,
to be like everywhere. Do you have thoughts on that?
oh, I
Like
mean,
improbable coincidence?
there are a lot. I mean, Thomas is by definition an improbable coincidence, right? I mean, throughout his life and career. I mean, going back to the Greek thing, I mean, especially in this section, I wondered, is he a daemon? You know, is there something daimonic about him?
Yes.
Also, the fact that his name is Thomas and means twin, and in some respects, he ends up in the same places as Max, has similar view, takes in the same information, and has a lot of the same thoughts as Max, but acts on them very differently and functions very differently. So I mean, there's a real interesting twinning here, and just the fact that he's always there to somehow make make Max's life maybe not necessarily safer, but to help Max along the way as something of a guide. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's I'm curious to see how that progresses throughout the rest of the novel. Because it it definitely that when I was mentioning earlier that like some of the structural things around the Greek tragedies and the kindly ones reference, when Thomas started to seem more like something supernatural to me is where I'm like, okay, I think the rubber is starting to hit the road a little bit, even more here with what we might be getting into.
And do you want to explain? I guess I should have asked you to do this earlier when you referenced this, like where what the kindly ones what it means or what it stands for with respect to Greek tragedy.
Sure. The kindly ones is another name for I'm gonna blank on the Greek name. No. But it's basically the harpies. The harpies from Greek mythology are assigned to torture, not necessarily kill, but to basically they're a punishment mechanism, and they're often invoked, and they show up in the tragedies, especially the I think the Oresteia, which is what this is coming from, to punish those who commit who shed blood of family. That's one of the great sins is to to kill a family member, and that's all over Greek mythology and in the tragedies, and it's one of the things that gets explored so heavily by the ancient Greek playwrights. Um, so the kindly ones in this context is referring to the harpies, but at the end of a trial, there a judgment is delivered that the person should not should not be sentenced. The sentence they're found not necessarily innocent, but the harpies should not punish them. And then the name changes from a punishment form to the kindly ones. So it's sort of hinting at a lot of those things. The incestuous relationship with his sister is also pulling from that. I mean, he's it's interesting that he's writing this novel of World War II and the Holocaust and the Nazis, but he's got this potential overlay of Greek tragedy on it, or at least references to it, which Max is referencing all the time. He brings up Herodotus in this section, with Greek historian, but that they're all. But then on top of alongside of that, he also has this musical metaphor with the names of the sections. So he's playing with a lot of different things, and I'm going to reserve my judgment on how well that structure, how well those whether those are nods or whether they're like integral parts of the structure of the novel, because I don't think you can tell that until you. I get the feeling you won't be able to tell that until you finish reading this novel.
Yeah. I, and going back to your comment about Thomas, and the twinning thing and the fact that he could be representative of a daemon, I guess the latter seems quite plausible to me because, you know, Thomas is like this, you know, Max is very impolitic, and that's been getting him into a lot of problems. And Thomas has warned him about that previously, and even kind of said, well, or kind of implied, I tell them what they want to hear, and that's why I'm advancing, and you're not, basically through the
Mm-hmm.
ranks. But in this section too, we continually see Thomas. Um, I'm not quite sure whether Thomas is fooling himself or just talking to Max as though he were talking to his superiors, because he continually calls Max a defeatist, where to me Max is often a realist, just kind
Mm-hmm.
of, saying this is horrific. I mean, way back in, I think when they were still in Ukraine, um, and Max was identifying to Thomas all of the problems that were set up to occur because they didn't have the provisions they were going to need to survive a winter in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And and then Max, or Thomas, your defeatist, Max. And here too, when Max says, well, I wanted to be stationed here. I asked to be stationed in Stalingrad because I know that once we win this war, the people that were the leaders of Stalingrad are going to be the ones that are going to be praised. And so, Thomas doesn't even want to even admit or refuses to uh, at least publicly entertain the notion that, yeah, we might not be getting out of here.
Yeah. Though I think that as that section moves along, Thomas gets, I mean, at the outset when they first encounter each other again, Thomas is very much the raw bureaucrat and taking the idea of like, you know, it's not it's not my job to say one way or the other. I'm just, I'm gonna say what they want to hear and continue to advance and all that. He gets quieter. Everyone gets quieter over the course of this section. I mean, there isn't the only real heavy conversation is the one that Max has with Pravdin, the Soviet commissar. Um, I think it's commissar, is his title. Um, but even Thomas seems to get quieter as things move along, as things get more desperate. Which also, like, if he is something of a supernatural figure, having him take on more of that sort of that human personality, that human interaction would make a lot of sense, right? Like it throws you off the trail a little bit that even Thomas seems to be suffering more about what you should be suffering during the siege of Stalingrad as a Nazi officer.
I thought it was really fascinating the parts where uh, Thomas, or excuse me, Max also encounters another old friend, and that's the medical doctor. I think his
Mm-hmm.
name is Dr. Honig,
Yes.
and um, Honig is sent to Stalingrad to. Um, the Nazis were so grotesque that they're sending their own people to study their soldiers' starvation, rather than rather than trying to. I'm sure they were trying to solve the problem as well because they knew they were going to have to feed the soldiers to win the war. But I don't know. There's something macabre about just like go you know go study the effects of the malnutrition on our soldiers. But um, Honig is seems to be convinced that there's something more than malnutrition here. That's or cold or the elements that's describing the deaths that are happening and amongst the German side. And it's almost this death of their spirit, that
Right.
there's some kind of, I don't know, what do I want to say, like almost a, a mysticism or a defeatism that has entered their bodies, that they're dying more frequently and more often than Honig thinks that they should, with their rations of 1,000 calories a day.
Right. And he points out that there are so many factors that trying to figure out what's actually causing or like that it's probably any number of things, but yeah, his main point is this is just too fast. Like it's too massive, it's too many, it's too quick. Um, and I don't know. It feels like they're I feel like Honig or Thomas would point to the idea of like the death of the Volk, right? Like the death of this national spirit is what's killing these men faster. That they've lost faith, the faith that got them there. Even though Honig makes the point that a lot of them are still remaining, they remain steadfast in their belief in Hitler and the party. Um, Maybe something else is breaking. Although, I mean, that's kind of what Pravdin is getting at in his conversation with Max. That um, not only are they not only are they screwed in Stalingrad, but they've already lost the war. And it's not just because they overextended themselves on two fronts and they're eventually going to get crushed between the Russians and the rest of the Allies, but that there's a death of the spirit that's taken place by the very nature of Nazism. Um, so I don't know. I think maybe that's kind of poking around the edges of that idea as well.
Yeah.
through
Bef-
Honig.
before after Max has this conversation with Honig about malnutrition and the deaths, Max is remembering being bullied as a school kid. And
Mm-hmm.
then he kind of extrapolates or expands on that to talk about what happens uh, when the strong try to overcome the weak.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about the fact that both the strong and the weak are consumed with anxiety, fear, and doubt, but the weak know it and suffer because of it, while the strong do not perceive it. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that just like just like being bullied, now the German army, who were the bullies, um, are are now kind of being overcome by what he calls the slow rising of the internal flood, and that was what was killing them. And
Yep.
he says it's also rising in me too, this internal flood. So yeah, I guess maybe to Max it's kind of this awakening of your own vulnerability, perhaps, might be causing some of, in some way, indirectly, some of the dying that's happening with the German soldiers.
Could also be methamphetamine withdrawal, given how many of those
Yeah,
soldiers were
good
were
point.
drugged up were drugged up to get there in the first place. Yeah, that section to me, this is page 390 in my paperback edition. But the one you're talking about, I made a note of it as I was reading it. Thus, the weak are a threat to the strong and invite the violence and murder that pitilessly strike them down. The strong's reaction to the weak, which is in some ways a corruption of Nietzsche and gets very much folded into both Nazism, but also some elements of German Volk culture. That this emphasis on strength. Um, we come back to this period or elements of this period of Germany and German thought in our readings together quite a bit, don't we, Lori? It feels
Yeah,
like.
it's true.
Um, but yeah, that section to me is really, I mean, it's really interesting. It's also interesting, and just another thing before, if we are moving off of Honig, his so when they fly in together, and Honig seems in relatively good spirits about this opportunity because he's seeing it as a research experiment, right? And and he in some ways seems far more optimistic than Max about what probably the reality on the ground is. And then when they meet back up, Honig is, he's beaten down just like everyone else is by the conditions. But as he's discussing or telling Max, it's not really even that much of a discussion, but as he's telling Max his findings and some of his theories or the lack thereof, he makes a comment about how I didn't mark the page, but he makes a comment about how many test subjects he has as a result to try and figure this out with. And there's a way that it's written that really gets across almost like a gleam in his eyes at the scientific opportunity afforded him here, which is really dark, but also reflective of, like, as you were saying, of what he was being sent there to do, right? Like he's being sent there to conduct a research study on by by the Nazi high command on their own soldiers who are in extremis, who are starving to death, dying faster than they should be, and almost completely cut off from any support, with really no good plan to how to save them. So yeah, I think I just found that interesting, and also just again, back to what Littell's doing. He doesn't even say there's anything like what I said, like a gleam in his eye or whatnot. But there's just something about the way he's talking that you get the sense that this, you know, entrepreneurial, sick medical spirit is still there inside of Honig, even with the conditions being as terrible as they are.
Yeah, he talks about having done 30 autopsies. And then, do you remember the gruesome detail that he talks
Oh
about,
yeah,
that he makes his assistants sleep with the corpses and kind of rotate them so that they don't freeze? And one time the assistant fell asleep, and and the corpse that he was supposed to be, I guess, like rotating close to the oven or the fire, like one side of the dead guy was roasted and the other side was still frozen.
Yeah, it's horrifying. Like it's yeah, and it just has, and throughout this and uh, I can't, assuming that you read this novel having no like real background or awareness of what the Nazis did or what World War II was like or what World War II specifically was like, for those areas that were under Nazi control in the early part of the war. There's this ring of veracity to these, like to all this, that is really, I don't know, kind of flooring in its own way, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, it never feel, it doesn't, don't want to say never, but it really doesn't ever, it really doesn't feel grotesque for its own sake. That always seems very consistently to be part of whatever the larger point that, or larger investigation that Littell's undertaking here is.
Yeah, I think that's one of the real conundrums with the book, and a point of hot debate is is the violence here exploitative?
Right.
Is it is it unnecessary to get into a lot of these details? Um,
Yeah. I popped onto the Wikipedia entry, just avoided plot. But I was just curious because of the critical reaction, and from what I've read so far, I think I kind of side more. And I think it was Michael Korda who had the response to Michiko Kakutani, who just really panned the book, um, and was, I don't know that I didn't read her full review, so but was all but saying that, if not explicitly saying that it was exploitative, that this is unnecessary, all those things. And Korda's response was something along the lines of, "If you want to go to hell, here it is. Like this is what hell looks like. This is what this was." And I think that argument is probably the more interesting one to me. Is, okay, you know, he is laying, in writing this, he is laying out and he is using like the facts of history of what took place here, and he's not really pulling any punches about what a person like this in these circumstances would have witnessed and taken part in, all those things. I think the better questions are, why are you writing this? Like, is there a purpose to this beyond simply recounting those things? But also, what is the purpose of Max in all this? Like, and that's this specific character. Again, this kind of breaks my rule of caring what the author is trying to do, because I'm curious, like, why are you doing all this research and, you know drinking and eating all this poison? Like, what is it that you're trying to figure out, or talk about, or lay bare? And yeah, I think this is the kind of book you need to probably have to read the whole thing to come to any kind of conclusion about.
well, I guess one theory could be that, um, and I did a long time ago read the whole book, but I don't know whether I thought about making a or trying to make a conclusion about this, but you know, it's possible Littell is trying to prove that, yeah, we all have a little bit of Max in us. That could be one thing. I think, although it's really horrible to try to think that it's not really anything that we'd want to admit, um, but also, I think the ludicrousy of trying to uh, racially classify people. I think this holds a real, effective mirror to that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, especially that part again in the Caucasus, it's just like they're literally trying to twist themselves into knots to try to figure out who deserves to die and who doesn't, and it's all so ridiculous.
Right. I mean, and even I think it was interesting, the distinction made between what the Wehrmacht wanted versus what the SS wanted. The Wehrmacht is like, hey, if we don't mess with these people, they're probably going to be on our side, and everyone else that lives around them, it doesn't really care, like doesn't want them wiped out. So like this actually probably works for us, and we got plenty of fighting to do. We can use this material elsewhere. Like let's move on. Whereas the SS is thinking, well, actually, how does this work? And like they're engaging in some sort of absolutely insane racial 2 a.m. drunk college philosophical conversation, and then deploying their conclusions to wipe people off wipe communities off the face of the earth. Like, I mean, if that is part of his point and part of what he's trying to unveil or discuss, cool. Like, I mean, I think that's actually, I think him poking at the absurdity of Nazi and even like just writ large fascistic thought is in its own, that's always a worthwhile endeavor. As we're finding in our current circumstances, it's important not to give that thought oxygen, because it isn't it isn't ever in conversation with anything else. It is simply about enforcing itself and replicating itself like cancer. It's not designed to change or to alter or to move towards the greater good for anyone other. It's simply an acquisition of power. And if that's part of what he's doing, great. That works for me.
Yeah, yeah. I think that he's doing a good job of illustrating just how arbitrary and made up those distinctions are,
Mhm.
and that they just like are trying to, you know, make make BS arguments to justify, this quest for some kind of bogus racial purity that that doesn't even not only does the objective not make sense, but the means to getting there totally don't make sense either because of the distinctions that they are making that are based on nothing.
Right. I mean, I think Providence comment here, page 394, you didn't imitate Marxism, you perverted it. The substitution of race for class, which leads to your proletarian racism, is absurd. And I mean, Providence goes in repeatedly on it and really, and Max in return, his retorts about trying to do that Stalin in mobilizing is appealing to the same things of nationalism and the strong ruler in order to get the country to fight back. And Providence acknowledges it and acknowledges that, yeah, it's interesting. Providence in some ways is echoing something that Marx, I think it was Marx, said, it's Marx or Engels, when asked about a revolution, Marxist revolution taking place in Russia, and saying, hell no, that's a terrible idea. That country is not remotely prepared to, because it didn't have the proper industrial base and so much of those things. Providence is almost, Max is poking at that. Providence is acknowledging it and just saying, well, we just need more time, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a basic flaw to your philosophy that prevents you from ever achieving any of what you want, because you will always, it is so exclusionary and so focused on simply the simple acquisition of power and control for such a small number of people, that you always will need more enemies, and you will always need to wipe out the next group, and you will always need to tighten and tighten the circle, and sooner or later there's no one left.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hope that you will continue reading with us, Tom.
Oh yeah.
um,
I'm 400 plus pages in now. It's kind of, I think we're past the in for a penny, in for a pound point. Like, I think I just kind
okay.
of need to finish it off. So
Yeah.
yes.
Well, and the good thing is that, as you said, like, um, y you don't get bogged down. At least I haven't in any
No.
point of the reading so far. I mean, it's eh, I'm struggling for a word that is more appropriate than entertaining, but it but the prose.
Pacey. It's
Yeah,
pacey, right?
yeah,
It turns over. It keeps on clicking and clicking and clicking, and does a really nice job of that. And that's it it would not work, I don't think, if it wasn't that at
Yeah.
all.
I mean, and it's a compelling story. I'm still very curious as to, at the end of this, am I going to think that Max is kind of emblematic of fascism, or is
Hmm.
he just going to be kind of, I don't know, a product of one of the bazillion variations of fascism?
Right. Is this a broken person who happened to get caught up into this machinery? Who, I mean, for instance, if he hadn't gone into the field of study that he went into, he would not necessarily have ended up where he ended up. So, how much of this is the happenstance of history combined with a psychologically distinct individual, or is it a larger point, a larger, as you were saying, like emblematic of something else? And I'm curious to see how that plays out, and I'm really curious to see how he continues to pull in the Greek tragic elements to it. Like what is he going to explore with that? How much how much does that work, and how much doesn't it? Because yeah, it can be a good to great, or even a phenomenal novel, and still have elements of it that just don't quite meet the mark. And I'm curious. So
Well, if you're still interested and want to come back on in another 400 pages,
I can
let me
absolutely come back.
know.
Yeah, let's talk. But I think I would be very curious to when this is done, to kind of chat about where we wind up, and how much what places this goes, and and what Max does between this very odd end to this section, and what must be coming next, because this section ends bizarrely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
All right, Tom. So nice to see you today, and thanks for joining.
thank you for having me.